Welcome to the SANS webcast. My name is Lisandra Capella. I will be your presenter today, together with Jason Lam. We will be talking about the 3 cloud security differentiators for leaders. Cloud technology is at the heart of a lot of organizations. And with this technology also comes a lot of complexity. And this makes a primary target for cyber threats. The goal of today's presentation is to provide you the knowledge and the practical strategies based on the SANS Cloud Security Maturity Model. Before we start going into the presentation, I want to give you just a bit of background information about me and Jason. So as I said, my name is Lisandra Capella. I'm the founder of Checkmate Cyber Consultancy. It's a cyber consultancy based in the Dutch Caribbean. We focus on providing cybersecurity services. One of the services that we provide is providing improvement of security posture on-premise as in the cloud. I have been working in the cybersecurity industry and IT industry for about 15 years now. Started off as a programmer, worked for about 6 years as a programmer, and then I got asked if I would be interested in assisting the organization in their patch management process. I eventually did it. Put the program up and running. And then I got offered to lead a cybersecurity team for the bank. And 29 GRC certifications later, I'm now still very passionate about cybersecurity. And I have been a SME subject matter expert for SANS for the past 7 years. One of the projects that I have been assisting with is the SANS Cloud Security Maturity Model. The creator of this project, of this model, is Jason Lam. And I think the best person to talk about this model and about himself is Jason himself. So I'm going to hand over the mic to Jason.
Thanks, Lysandra. And hi, everyone. Just giving you a quick intro about myself. I'm Jason Lam, and in my day job, I work in the financial industry for the last, over 20 years now, doing many different things within security area. But when I'm not doing my day job protecting sort of the financial systems, I am a superhero. That's what I tell people. I write all sorts of different security material, like the material that you're going to see today, and trying to drive some of these best practices around. And I'm very passionate when I can help other people secure their infrastructure, their environment, their cloud security as well. That's what makes me very happy. And we'll be talking to you about quite a bit about how each of us see the cloud security and how we can differentiate our organizations. We obviously see a lot of different organizations getting hacked. How do we not become one of those, right? That's really some of the things that we're going to talk to you about. So Lysandra, why don't you kick it off?
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jason. So as Jason just said, we will be talking today about understanding our current risk landscape, what's going on out there right now, what are we doing right now, and find out ways which we can do better. And also talk about the important changes to consider using the Cloud Security Maturity Model. So let's start looking at our current threat landscape, the risks that we have right now. For this purpose, we selected 3 recent hacks from China, Microsoft, and US Department of Defense. You often have people pointing fingers at China saying, hey, they're always on the attack. But if you take a look at this, they have issues of their own. In this case, it wasn't really a sophisticated hack. They had a dashboard for the police department, and this was left wide open on the internet for anyone to access. For me, the remarkable part about this hack was that they were able to exfiltrate 23 terabytes of data, and no one noticed it. Can you imagine that? And that's something that's remarkable because besides having a misconfiguration in place, they probably didn't have proper monitoring in place either. The next one we have on the list is Microsoft, which got notified by SOC Radar that they had a few misconfigured blobs that were accessible for everyone on the outside. This left them exposed with customer details and emails. And the last example we have here is US Department of Defense. The US Department of Defense had an email server that was publicly accessible. It was hosted on Azure and was publicly accessible through an IP for everyone to access. Anyone with access was able to read emails from the military or health records. If you take a step back and think about these three examples that we have just shown, they all of them have one thing in common. We're talking about misconfiguration, security misconfigurations. And that's our first change that we will be looking at more in depth. So let's start with that. You can compare cloud as a toolbox. You have a toolbox, and in that toolbox, you have different set of tools. When you take out a tool, before you can use it, you often need to read a manual. And that's the same with all these services. Each one comes with their own manual. Just take a look at what we have right now on screen with this diagram. You're seeing cloud platform, storage, container server. Each one will have their own configuration, their own manual. Setting it up right now, configuring it properly, perfectly, doesn't mean that tomorrow it's still perfectly. Tomorrow probably you will have to tweak it again. And that means as you're rolling out more services, using more services, you have to strike a balance between the change and also getting the things right. One of the things that we're often asked is, okay, so this toolbox is from the cloud service provider, right? The CSP. But where do they fit in this picture? So I'm going to use a gym analogy with this. It fits perfectly with the picture chosen there. You sign up for a gym. The first day you come to the gym, you have all these big dreams. And that's the same when people start moving to the cloud. They have these dreams. They're going to be efficient. They're going to save money. Everything is going to be so much smoother. And then they enter the gym and they see all these equipments, and they can be daunting how to use them. And then they get a coach, a personal coach that's going to guide you. And that's your CSP. They provide guidance. They provide tools and technique. But when you need to do the heavy lifting the weights, you're actually responsible to do that yourself. You're on your own. And that's a shared responsibility. Google Cloud goes a bit further. They introduce the shared fate. So if we go back to the gym analogy, you can think about it that you have a workout, they're sitting next to you, and they say, you know, I think for you, the best plan is actually to just start lifting smaller weights, less weights. And they help adjust the workout plan for you. Both of these scenarios, you have a partner. So if you have a partner, what to expect from your partner? How is the partner going to assist me? And let's take a look at this example. So we're going to continue on the gym. You're in the gym, you want to break a record. You're working out with this lifting weights. And your coach looks at you and says, you know, if you continue doing that, you're going to injure yourself. I recommend for you to not continue. And these are the potential risks. And this is a much safer technique to use this weight instead of that. And that's the same thing that your CSP is doing. If we take a look at what you're seeing on screen right now, the screenshot you have there, this is an example of launching an EC2 in AWS. That's a virtual machine. In case of the EC2, AWS automatically disables the auto assign of a public IP. They're trying to protect you against a misconfiguration. Even if you decide to do a misconfiguration, making it publicly available, changing it to anywhere, that anyone can access the VM from anywhere, you will get a warning. Hey, you're opening it up to the world. In the end, it's your responsibility. You can still decide, you know something? I'm going to continue pushing this weight because I want to be the world champion. But it's your responsibility. And this is how they are trying to guide you. So, of course, going to the cloud, you want to make things more efficient. And that's where infrastructure as a code comes in. Because when you're at your gym, you might first start changing those weights manually, but then you say, you know, there's an automatic system here that can change the weight for me as I go along. And that's often what happens in the cloud. You want to be able to quickly deploy more resources, and people start using code. But would that mean that anyone would be able to program those weight machines? No, because what's going to happen if everybody just program without knowing exactly how to work them? You're going to have weights flying all around. And that's exactly one of the risks that we are seeing here, is that a lot of people, without knowing coding best practices, are using the code to deploy the infrastructure. It's like a beginner trying to lift advanced weights without the proper form. So what's the proper form? Let's take a look at this example. And this is an example that we got from ChatGPT. You might be laughing at this point if you have a bit of knowledge about deploying a bucket, because seeing all this misconfiguration, let me just get my laser pointer. If you look at this, enable public access. This is a configuration to deploy a AWS bucket, S3 bucket. Public write access, disable logging, all are set to true. This is horrible, but ChatGPT did a pretty good job of giving us a really horrible AWS deployment. But you might be thinking, okay, so who would be deploying this? Let's imagine you get an assignment and someone says, hey, you need to deploy quickly a few AWS S3 buckets using code. What's the first thing you're gonna do? You're gonna go and you're gonna Google. You're most probably gonna end up on Stack Overflow and you will find the code there. Looking at the code, you might miss 1 or 2 lines that has some misconfiguration. And that can result in a leak, what we call a leaky bucket, that would result in data breach or data leakage. And this is one of the risks that you might be running. It's not just about using the tool, but also using it correctly, the configuration correctly. So ChatGPT can help us also with a misconfiguration, but let's see how ChatGPT can actually be a useful tool for your security strategy toolbox. This is an example of a configuration. I know it's very small, but trust me, it's a configuration that we have there. And what we did was ask ChatGPT, how can you take a look at this? Can you give us some recommendations, security recommendations? Is this a good configuration? Can you spot any glaring errors in this config? Can you improve it? So let's take a look at what ChatGPT provided us as recommendation. And this is pretty impressive. If you have taken any SANS courses, you will see that a lot of these that are being recommended, public access, enabling public access, the risks that are talking, disable public access, restrict access. These are a lot of the recommendations that we're also getting in these classes. Because ChatGPT is like a good friend you have that has just read all the manuals. And it's able to provide you the answers in a matter of seconds at any time when you need it. In the end, you need to remember that you're responsible for whatever you're getting from there. So you need to review that also. So let's take a look about some of the tools that are available. Just like in a gym, you have different equipment, but just having the equipment is not enough for you to get fit, right? So there are a lot of different cloud native tools that you can use. Some are free, some might cost you something, but choosing the right machine that you're going to be using really depends on your own scenario and on your needs. As you can see, each one of the cloud providers has their own type of machines available for you, equipment for you to use. The other one available is Cloud Security Posture Management. This is like having your own security squad. A Cloud Security CSPM can do different things. It can provide your reports or actively make changes for you. And just like in a gym, you can have different trainers. You can have different providers that can provide you different recommendations. Again, it comes back to you to decide which one fits your scenario the best. We have an example of a CSPM. I do want to say we're not endorsing this vendor, but it's a really good example of a workout, let's say a gym workout plan that they have. So these are based on their recommendation. They have tried it. They have providing you, hey, this is the best way for you to lift weights. This is how I recommend you to do it. And if we take a close look, I know it's a bit, for me at least, it's a bit small, but it says you're getting the recommendation, enable encryption at rest. This is based on their best practices. This is not a one-size-fits-all. It's important for you to also adjust it to your unique fitness routine or your unique environment. As I have just shown you 2 different examples, I know you probably are asking, okay, Lisandra, so should I be using native tools or should I be using CSPM? Well, it's kind of, I'm going to come with an audit answer. I'm going to say it depends. And it really depends on your scenario. If you're just starting out, the CSPM might be the right one because it already has the best practices there. It can provide you the framework, But as your cloud maturity grows and your organization becomes more understanding of its own environment, you want to start using those native tools and build your own guardrails and shape your own environment. It's like owning a gym. You want to have your own rules at your gym. If someone does go off track, you have the CSPM that can help you nudge you back on track. One thing important to note about configuration, it's the same as with the gym. I know at the beginning of the year, a lot of people buy gym equipment, they buy new sneakers, they're gonna get in shape, but having those equipment doesn't put you in shape. And that's the same thing with configuration. In the cloud, just crafting a secure configuration, it's like planning your fitness regime, but it's not enough to just have the plan. You also need to make sure that everybody is following the plan, doing the same workout, lifting the same weight. Everybody's on the same page as what a securely configured environment is. And this is where the cloud security maturity model can help us with. And this is in this screenshot, you're seeing part of this cloud security maturity model. And you can compare it again. I'm gonna go back to the gym. I love the picture that Jason put there. I'm gonna go back to a trainer at the gym. You will have a trainer and the trainer will start. So this model will help you understand where you are in your journey. It will be a roadmap to achieve a secure cloud environment. Okay, so you are here right now, you're in manage right now. So these will be the steps for you to move further. It's really about fine-tuning your fitness in the configuration step by step, using these maturity levels, and those are from the CMMI, using them as a guidance. So if we take the initial one, you're just starting out on your fitness journey, you're just starting out, and it's just basic configuration management. But if we take a look and we go a bit further optimizing, right now you're finally reaching your peak fitness, you're monitoring everything, and you're continually fine-tuning that and fine-tuning your configuration for maximum security. So let's take a close look how this fits into the complete cloud security maturity model. And this is an amazing poster that has been created by Jason, and it shows the different domains and the capabilities that are available. And I think the best person to actually talk about this model and the poster is Jason. So I'm gonna hand it over back to Jason.
Cool. Hey, thanks, Lysandra, for walking us through one of the most important sort of changes and transformation, the differentiator that all of us need to drive our cloud environment towards, which is really the cloud configuration. So configuration, as Lysandra was alluding to, is really, really, really difficult, right? Like to get right. There are so many different aspects of it, and it's just very difficult to get correct. And if you nail down one, you may have other configurations that don't get right? So this is the world that we live in cloud security. And in cloud security, I've heard a lot of different feedback from people. Is like, there's this thing, there's that thing. There's so many different diverse aspects that you need to manage. And, which is why we have created this, cloud security maturity model at SANS that actually help people to figure out, what is it that if you're entering the cloud, right? What do you actually need to do? And, while, you're probably seeing the screen and you're looking at it like, oh my God, I need a microscope, not even glasses, microscope to take a look at it. This particular poster that we put all these consolidated information into is actually online. I am going to go on, the Zoom chat in a second to put it on. But if you can't find it, or if you're listening to this recording later, you can probably Google it pretty easily. Cloud security maturity model, SANS. You can probably find it. It's a poster that we're putting together. And once again, the highlight of it is that we put together the phases of the maturity, like from 0 to hero. 5 phases just lining up with CMMI, your initial, manage, defined, quantitatively manage, and optimizing. Those are the phases. And in each of the area, like config management, for example, which is on screen, we give you the 5 stages of where things should be as you're trying to nudge your state of security forward in that particular area. And by the way, there are 8 different domains that we have put together. And within the domains, there are different capabilities, right? Inside infrastructure, architecture, and protection, we have like 5 different things that we're measuring, the 5 different capabilities. So that's how it looks. That's why, it's a very, very busy chart with a lot of information that are consolidated into it. Needless to say, right, where SANS and, all these information are also available. That's what we go over in the course, the Leadership 520, that is cloud security for leaders. That's what we cover. The whole scope, entire thing of this poster is what we cover in that course. Next slide, please. So that was the first, sort of change, the differentiator that we talk about. And by the way, just administratively, if you want to ask any questions, please use the chat function. I'll get to all those questions towards the end of the presentation. Using the Q&A function will help us consolidate all the questions together. And we'll address all of that later on. So with that, let's get into the second differentiator or change. It's going to be about IAM. Well, first thing, as Lysandra drove us towards the attention of configuration, the second item, I would definitely say that if you're new into cloud security, I would say that it's very important that you look at your configuration. The second item that I would definitely, suggest that you take a look into would be your IAM, right? Like identity and access management tends to be a weak spot for a lot of organizations. And, it's not because people want to neglect it. It's because in a lot of ways or in a lot of cases, organizations find it very, very, very difficult, right? For each user that you may have, there are thousands of different, entitlement or permissions that you have to manage. That's one side of the complexity, but then also how you architect your entire identity structure matters a whole lot as well. And it needs to back into some sort of fact-based HR record. Well, quite a few organizations fall there, right? Like, because, people have left the organization and they still have an account, somewhere else in the organization. That is some of the gotchas that we've seen a lot. And these things certainly need to be thoughtful from the ground up. As you get into the cloud area, you need to think through some of these things. And this is not to say that, hey, if you haven't thought through it, can you fix it? Absolutely, right? You can absolutely go back and fix it. But then, what we want to talk about today is some of the concise information about what sort of best practices that you can talk about here, right? So next slide, please. So over here, as we talk about IAM, right? Identity and access management. The identity is the authentication, and the access management is authorization, right? Like auth N and auth Z, right? Or auth Z, depending on which side of the ocean you come from. But so with regards to particularly the authorization here, right? Like the access control, let's imagine that, is Jason, right? Like me, okay? So I have these particular permissions. What does it look like, right? So this is how you define permission, your access control in AWS, one of the cloud. You may come in and say, I don't use AWS, I use other cloud. Well, don't worry. It's pretty much, in case we haven't heard some of our previous webcasts and so on, most of the cloud service provider from a leadership standpoint, is pretty much similar, right? Like, I'm not saying that all the brand name and everything tends to be the same. It is different. But how we need to manage cloud security across, different cloud service provider tend to be very similar, right? There are certain nuances that are different, but this particular concept of having an access policy that you tie back into a user, into a subject, into a principal, are really very similar across, most of the cloud service provider, be it Google, be it Oracle, Azure, they're all pretty much the same. So if I can walk you through very quickly about what is going on here, right? So I can see the word allow. That means that we're specifying what this user JSON can actually access. And this allow JSON, if I'm the user, to access S3 buckets. As Lysandra was talking about, these are the online storage area that you can rent from your cloud service provider, that people can use a web browser to go and pick up some of the files. And in this particular policy, you have certain level, like you can upload files, which is the put object. You can download some of the files, which is get object, and so on. And then at the bottom, the last part, which is the resource, that shows you that which of the resource this particular policy is tied into. And this particular resource, you can see a star at the very end. That basically is wildcard. Essentially, the user is able to access any sort of S3 bucket, right, in the environment. So if you have 1,000 different S3 bucket, the user probably can access all of them, right? Like there are a couple other variations here, right? But yeah, that's, if you have a star, that's what it means, is a wildcard situation. So that's what it looks like. And those of you who are following me all along, you can tell it gets pretty crazy very quickly, because this by itself may not be complex, but imagine that you have a few hundred for each user, then it gets very, very difficult to manage. Next slide, please. And the complexity just doesn't just end there, right? The complexity also ends with many other steps, right? This diagram is a good illustration about how complex these things are. Now, where did I get this diagram? I did not draw it. It actually came from AWS. AWS published this diagram to say, hey, when you actually go and access an object inside your cloud environment, these are the considerations that we're going through to evaluate whether you can access the object. If you look at it, right, like, hey, is there a deny? There are organization level, SCP that actually, have further policy about what you can and cannot do. And then there is resource. At a resource level, the bucket may have its own. At the end of the day, I'm not going to deep dive into it, but I can tell you that, even this flowchart illustrates to you that it's not just one policy that you need to manage, it's many different ones for just one single access. So, this just shows you that the complexity compounds very quickly. With this, what we have here is, another layer of complexity, which is the identity environment. Your identity environment, let's take a look at the left-hand side, right? Like left-hand side is all the, you can call it containers or hierarchy structure across the three big cloud providers, the AWS, Azure, and also GCP. The hierarchy basically goes like that, right? Like you have a stack of hierarchy for different resources. How do you structure your account? Each organization will need to go and figure out, how their organization need to look like with respect to their users and the resource. How do you actually group them? Because likely you're going to say these group of resources can be accessible by this bunch of users. So structuring that is another layer of complexity as well. Next slide, please. So having talked about all those complexity, right? Like then we can take a look at, knowing the challenge, knowing the problem. Let's take a look at it, right? Like how do we need to deal with some of these problems? One thing first, right? Like somebody went and surveyed over the big three cloud service provider, AWS, Azure, and GCP, and they found that there are literally, right, 240K permissions. If you use all the services across multi-cloud and so on, nobody does, by the way, right? This is a hypothetical sort of number, but at maximum, you can have 240K permission, right? Like, I don't know about you. I personally, in my enterprise, I probably have like, maybe 40 to 50 different permissions. And yeah, that's already very difficult for me to keep track of what permission I have. 240K is substantial, right? So that's sort of another complexity. In order to manage that more effectively, your cloud service provider know that they're giving you rocket science to solve, right? Like a rocket science level problem to solve, so that they actually want you to be manageable, as Lysandra pointed out, right? Like is share responsibility, share fate. they want to help you with it. How do they actually help you with it is that they come up with this, sort of standard template, right? They look at their customer base and they said, hey, most of my customer need this particular type. When you talk about S3, right? There are, the most common access is like read, is like write. So, they basically craft out, the policy that will address, probably 60, 70, 80% of the requirements for most organizations. And they give it to you as a template to say, hey, if you need S3 read access, this is the policy you need, right? Like, and they name it as such. Now, these are called, the built-in permission template. There are different names in each of the cloud service provider. In AWS, that would be the managed policy. In Azure, that would be the built-in roles. GCP, that would be between the basic and also predefined roles, right? Like that's the name of these mechanism. It's great because as you start out in the cloud environment, you would be picking off to use some of these default stuff, right? But one word of advice here, if you're in AWS environment, AWS managed policies are not something that you can directly use. The reason why is because the AWS way of doing things is that they actually tied, you saw it in the earlier slide, right? Like everything is star in those managed policies. So by default, if you use those policies directly, what you're going to end up with is way over permission. Most of the people you say, hey, I want S3 read access to this user, you effectively give that person or that machine account, right? The permission to read all the buckets in the environment. That's sort of the problem with the AWS policy. So the right way in AWS is actually copy that policy and use it instead of directly attaching it. But just some nuances there, right? But generally, in all, right, like it's relatively similar. But then, as I said earlier, even that is 60, 70, 80% fitting with most of the organization or all the organizations. So there are certain level of tweaking that most organizations need to do. You'll find that, once you get into the cloud, up and running, after a little bit of time, you see that, hey, most of these permission that I've used from the cloud service provider, it actually is overly permissive. I want to tighten it down because if I don't tighten it down, then there are extra risks that I'm bringing to the environment. I'm giving too much permission to each of the user. And this is where you can customize the role further. Next slide, please. So as we talk about managing the access, that's one side of it. So, what I'm illustrating here to you is that, it doesn't just go and say, hey, can I access it? If I can access it, everything is good. But from a security standpoint, we want to allow people to innovate, allow people to do their job, but at the same time, do so securely. So a model of approach to say at the starting point, we want to use the default roles, the default managed policies. Those are fine, right? But as you iterate through your journey of maturing your cloud security environment, what you want to do is start tightening some of those roles. And that would help you tremendously, right? So some of the other aspects over here is that, you need to structure an IAM program. Generally, people, most organization, I'm going to dare to ask, right? Like, if anybody feel that your organization is doing perfect in IAM, please reach out to me. I would love to learn a few things. I have made this offer many, many times. Nobody ever tell me that they're perfect, right? Most organizations struggle here, right? Like, and they struggle, in the sense that because you're dealing with something very, very diverse and large, it's very difficult to get right. So you need to structure a program to deal with these things. And it comes back down to, on the left-hand side is identity. So from identity standpoint, the short-term things that I can tell you about is federate, right? Like if you already have Active Directory, if you already have an IDaaS solution, then, federate. Because likely that Active Directory situation that you have been running for a number of years, and generally, it ties back into a fact-based HR system that you can trust. So you're likely going to use that environment to make sure that you anchor down into something. So federation initially is really, really crucial. And then on the right-hand side, right, like some of these differentiator, right, access, management is about using, as I said, right, using the standard stuff at the beginning, right? Like your cloud service provider said, hey, this is generally good enough for most people, start there, and then transition into something a lot more tightened. And you need to set up a program to do periodic review to continually tighten that particular environment. And obviously that needs support and funding. And generally understanding from the management area as well. Because, hey, if you don't know what you're managing, you don't know what to measure, you're not really managing it. So that's what it comes down to. And that's why we propose that most management get trained into this particular area so that they can manage it effectively. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the other aspects is fitting your organization. I already showed you some of these structure, but most of the organization really need to take a look at their own environment and see how you want to structure your organization into this mode. I'll give you a sense about this, right? A lot of people come and talk to me about, hey, I'm setting up my organization, cloud environment, this container this way. And a lot of people look at it from an organization structure standpoint. I have surveyed all the cloud service providers' best practices, and none of them tell you that you should structure your cloud environment according to your organization structure. What you should do is align it to the workload. That's where all the CSPs are telling people to do, right? So, if your workload, your 3 major application, well, structure it towards the application rather than, okay, here are the different teams, because teams in your cloud environment does not actually matter, right? What matters is actually, how you structure workload. So you can see on the diagram there that, all the structure are related to your application, your workload, your functionality, whether you're doing logging and so on. So those are the things that matters. Yeah, next slide, please. And one of the component over here that a lot of organizations started debating to get into as well is some of these CIEM, right? So is cloud infrastructure entitlement management. So earlier I talked about the 240,000 different permission, right? Like if you have that level of permissioning, how do you actually tighten it? How do you actually gain visibility? Some of these things, by the way, that term was coined by Gartner, right? Like, they certainly coin a lot of different technologies and so on. But these are the solutions that actually go and give you the visibility, use API against your own environment, pull in the data to figure out, hey, Jason can access these particular resources and there is an over permission, or the other side of it is Jason has not used this permission for 6 months or something like that. You may want to tighten that up. So these are the capabilities that get you, these services give you the power to tighten your environment and give you understanding about where over permission may be happening. Next slide, please. So with that, that's where, I talk about a poster and so on, the maturity framework. That's where, I'm just illustrating to you that, hey, this is all within this, the maturity model as well. We can then move on to our third differentiator that we want to talk about today. The third differentiator is a very, very fundamental one. Why is it so fundamental? Because it's the firewall, right? Like it's the network perimeter inside your cloud infrastructure. Being in the role that I'm in, in my day job and at SANS, I talk to a lot of people who are interested to move into the cloud or are currently into the cloud and wanting to know whether they are actually doing things right? Like as they come to the class, they learn about some of these things. They ask me the question, hey, which firewall do I use? Or am I structuring my network inside a cloud service provider correctly? The thing that, I want to talk about here, right, today is that it is in cloud, right? Like firewall network infrastructure is certainly somewhat important, but it's not the utmost important. The importance of it is significantly less as if you were running these workload in your on-prem data center. In your traditional network, yes, your network infrastructure, your perimeter, your your big giant wall that you sit out in front between you and your enemies are really, really, really important. But then this is not the thing that you want to focus on in your cloud environment. And I'll explain why as we go along here. Next slide, please. So on the left-hand side of this slide, we're showing you the difference between the traditional mindset, like your on-prem environment, and your cloud environment now. What we're looking at is that in your traditional environment, in your data center, you obviously, I came from a very long history in IT, been around IT for about 25 years at this point. I know I don't probably look it, but yeah, I can count that now, right? So at the very early on days, right, what is most important is really about the firewall, your endpoint protection. Those form the most fundamental basis of your security. And your defenses generally are based on your firewall segregating your enemies out. Everything is sort of onion based, right? Like on the outside, you're trying to distance yourself from the enemies. You're like, okay, if you can't get to me, it doesn't matter what inside my network is looking like, right? So that was the mindset for many, many years. And it worked well for us, right? As long as you can defend it, you can patch it, you can actually, use your firewall to separate the bad people outside of your four walls, you're doing pretty well. In the modern way, right? In the modern environment, that mindset doesn't work anymore. And it's not like, okay, if I have a firewall, you're doomed. It's not like that. But the focus of the defense is slowly but surely shifting over away from your firewall and your perimeter. Where we're shifting it to is really about your identity and access management, as we talked about earlier, right? So it becomes sort of your identity, it becomes your configuration. That actually forms your perimeter, not just your firewall. Your defenses, the front end of your defenses have shifted from the firewall over to some of these configuration and also IAM processes. And it is, it shift the, focus from, your firewall rules to, hey, do you do your IAM process properly and so on? Like, yeah, that's what the transformation is looking like. And then the next slide will show you the, some of the reasoning why, the transformation is happening. For example, right, like there are these platform as a service type of offerings that your CSP is offering to you. For example, what platform as a service could be is like notification service, right? Like, okay, so, you make an API call and they automatically make a phone call to alert your team on some situation. You're not running the server, you're not running even the software itself, right? So, those would be the platform as a service example. And these particular type of examples of services that are in that category, you really cannot put a firewall around the service. What it means is that, I'll name another example because we were talking about S3 bucket, right? You want to say, hey, I want to firewall all my resources, right? I want to firewall, well, because we all have the traditional mindset, particularly those of us who have so many years of experience now, right? Generally, the first thing that I think about is like, how do I distance myself? How do I run the isolation? How do I assume breach, right? Like, and run the isolation. And what it comes down to is I want to put the firewall in front of things. But in cloud environment, you simply cannot do that, right? What I cannot do is I cannot call up, AWS, Azure and say, hey, my blob storage, my S3 bucket, I want you to put a firewall in front of your service because my service is running in your environment, put a firewall there. Well, you can't really do that, right? So your firewall, so-called, right, is really your configuration to say, hey, this S3 bucket is mine. I don't want anybody else from the internet to access it. You can do that, but that's not a firewall, which is why I said that in the last slide, right? Like, hey, traditionally you have one single pane of glass to say, I am actually managing my access over the firewall. Now, in the new world, what you're doing is you're actually looking at the object, like the resource, and then you are looking at the configuration of the resource, also the IAM process to actually structure it accordingly. And there is actually another piece of control over here, which is your provider due diligence, right? Hopefully your CSP is actually safe and sound, right? Because if they fall down in security, you could be collateral damage as well. So recently, obviously most of you have heard, right? Like Microsoft, for example, they have certainly lost some of their keys and so on. So that created a very, very, very scary situation for a lot of organizations. It's like your mechanism to your lock may be safe, but then accidentally you leak out the master key to the bad guys. So that becomes a huge problem. So those are your defense line, right? And luckily, on that aspect that I was talking about Microsoft, right? They figure out what actually happened. So, I think there's a little bit of relief there because, for about a month, it was like, hey, we lost the key. We don't know how, or we're not telling you how yet. They're figuring it out. And, I think it was last month that they actually came out in the public to say, hey, this is how we've lost it. We have made some of the, changes and so on. So I think that's a reasonable thing that they said. And, hopefully it doesn't happen again. So that's where your network perimeter really has become. Okay, so it's no longer firewall anymore. But very careful about this. Next slide, please. In this slide, what we want to show you is that, if you go and randomly Google for solutions, because, hey, I don't know everything, neither do you, right? We go and we figure out how things work. Lysandra showed us that one of the knowledge source, which is pretty reliable, is actually ChatGPT. But other people have gone back into using Google, right? To say, hey, Google, what is my most important security feature, right? Like if you go and search it like that, I actually found a site, right? By the way, I don't even remember which website this is. I'm sure you can figure it out. But this website is saying you need a top of the line perimeter firewall. That totally contradicts to what industry is believing. That contradicts with what I just told you as well, right? So, my statement here with this slide is be very careful about who you listen to, because not all advice out there about, hey, these things are important, are actually accurate, right? We've seen a lot of different information that are not quite right on the internet. And there are a lot of bad advice that are being thrown around. So be careful, be cautious about who you get your advice from would be a very, very important thing here. Okay, so there are definitely bad advice. And to offer you some good advice, in the next slide, how do you actually, if your perimeter, your firewall and so on are not your real defense line, then what is your real defense line? What you want to think about is this. You still have your IaaS. A lot of organizations have lifted and shifted their virtual server into the cloud environment. For those situations, you do need your firewall because you're lifting and shifting your network over to, extending your network over to your cloud environment. In those situations, you do need your firewall. Then in that situation, go with what you're comfortable with, right? For example, a lot of organizations come to me and say, hey, Jason, I'm running Fortinet, I'm running Checkpoint and so on. Do I want to extend it over to your cloud service wider environment? Well, the answer is obviously overwhelmingly yes, sure. Because if you're running your virtual machine in your cloud environment, mimic what you're doing on-prem would not be a bad starting point, right? And you would want to make sure that things are working over there, optimize it with logging and so on. And by the way, also take a look at your egress. It's not just what's coming in that hack you. What about where your servers and environment can get out to, right? Because that's where your data get leaked. And that's how bad people, when they compromise your environment, they can send your information out to them, right? So those are some of the key points that you want to, you want to take a look at. And for some of those more modern cloud native application that you use a lot of PaaS-based services, where you want to drive that security defense line is de-emphasize your firewall. Start thinking about beyond your firewall and more into what is the configuration, right? What is my identity? Like, how do you actually structure that permission? That would be most important. And in order to test case and check to make sure that you're doing it right, most modern organizations also do this threat modeling or purple team exercises where you bring in the red, team sitting alongside with the blue team to validate that, hey, the red team is like, okay, I'm doing this attack against your environment. Blue team, can you see it, right? To validate that and am I still okay, right? So those are the things that you want to validate that, yes, you have visibility and also you're defending against those particular attacks and validate that your controls are safe and sound. So those are the crucial thing that we want to drive towards in order to secure your environment in this transformational thing over the cloud environment. With that, I think we're into our last slide to illustrate our what I've just talked about here, right? What I've just talked about is more of your network control and also a little bit of your architecture as well. So those show up in the poster as well. And if I can wrap up some of the information that we've talked about so far, right? What we have specifically talked about is we want to drive from a tool-based configuration management to active managed process. So Lysandra talked about, right, like, hey, there are tools, but then I've not heard one organization so far that has been hacked by, oh, we don't have the right tool. If you don't have tools, go ask ChatGPT. That's my statement, right? It's as simple as that. If you don't know, hey, am I doing this configuration right? Ask ChatGPT, is my configuration right? So it's not about the tool. It's about how you manage your configuration. Get the right people in place, get the right process, review your configuration periodically. The second thing is, as I talk about, IAM now is super crucial, right? So, it's not just, okay, can I get access to something, right? Like, it's way more than that. It becomes your firewall replacement. So you really need to structure it, and you need to find the right automation because nobody has enough staff to run that department. So get the right automation in place to structure some of the review, bring in some of the AI ML model to say, hey, that particular identity and that particular permission has not been used for 6 months. Eliminate that, right? Some of those things are really crucial. The last bit here is you want to start transforming your organization's mindset, not just yourself as a leader, but also drive it across the entire organization that, hey, we're shifting the dynamics from just focusing a lot on the firewall, being an on-off on access, to more towards a modern-based, identity-based perimeter. That's what you want to drive towards. And these differentiators are going to keep you safe, at least a lot safer, right? In your environment, and hopefully these helps you a lot. Last slide is, I think we have gone through all of our material here, right? Like, if you like some of these, shameless pitch here. If you like some of these material, these were some of the highlight of some of the topics that we cover in this course, which is the 520. We're running this course in as our first run. It's gone very, very successful as a 3-day class. So we're expanding it to 5 days, and we're running it in December 11th, on December 11th to 15th. And there's a discount, if you sign up for beta run. And we generally cover, the entire maturity model as I illustrated earlier. And, just to reiterate, if you want that maturity model, is free, you can download it. And so take a look at that, please. So we're happy to take the questions now. Let me see here. What's your take on AI role in cloud security hardening? I'll I'll give my answer first, and then I'll see what Lysandra has as well. So I think, I mentioned a few things already. The quantity, the number is staggering, is crazy. Like I can't manage that many items. So, without using some sort of ML, to actually, not just so much AI, right? But ML to actually help would be impossible to do. So particularly two areas, right? The CSPM that Lysandra has mentioned earlier, that is very crucial because, it continually scan across all your configurations to find out whether there are some that sticks out, like, hey, this one is probably a bad idea. So it continually help you with it. The other side of it is obviously the entitlement, the permission, right? Like if you truly have over 200K of permission, I don't know about you, I can't manage it. So you need some of these machine learning model to say, hey, Jason hasn't used this particular permission for a while. Let's kill that permission. So I am definitely very bullish about it. And that's how I feel about it. Lysandra, anything to add to that?
No, I think you said it all. It's really about it becomes unmanageable just to do it with your own eyes, and machine learning can be a second pair of eyes to go over it. I really recommend that.
Cool. Then next question here, is there a single tool interface to manage or automate multi-cloud configuration? So on this one, I'll give you a very, very short answer to some of these things, right? You can definitely, I'm not selling any sort of products or anything like that. Gartner has named these, things called the CNAPP, right? CNAPP, right? So these are the sort of integrated cloud, security platform. They do quite a bit, right? They basically incorporate the CIEM that I was talking about, incorporate the CSPM products into it as well, in order to, take a look at all of your security, be it configuration, identity, runtime protection. They have all of those, right? That's generally something that you want to start looking at. I don't have particular recommendation about which one is better, but some of the big players over there is like the Palo Alto, the Wiz, W-I-Z, Orca, O-R-C-A. Some of those are the platforms that you may want to take a look at, right? Like, if you're asking me one single tool, right? And then, you obviously in the industry, you have Microsoft trying to eat their lunch as well. Microsoft is trying to be not just Azure, but hey, they have tools in Azure that actually manage the other cloud. So that's where things are, okay? Lysandra, anything to add on that? Or you can take the next question as well.
So I'm seeing one come in about it's not too early to rely on ChatGPT for security consultation, considering the fact that it's sometimes not accurate. So I do agree about the inaccurate answers, and that's something that I have a discussion with Jason about a lot, because there are parts of the facts that they're just getting information from the internet, from the cloud security providers, and that's the same as you reading those pages, and those are reliable, but you do need to use some common sense when going through those items. Anything to add there, Jason?
Interesting question there. Like, by the way, I don't think Lysandra and I are saying that, oh yeah, just use ChatGPT, don't worry about any other tools. But, more to drive the fact that no organization lacks tools because you have so many different choices these days, right? The problem is generally a process issue, right? That's, and possibly leadership driving the right actions to happen. I think ChatGPT sometimes in silo, sometimes it gives you reasonable answer, but then how do you piece it all together, to actually, run it in your organization and propagate it across all your cloud environment? That becomes difficult. Yeah. All right. Is AWS network firewall not similar to the old-fashioned firewall? I think cloud simply need defense in depth. Absolutely. So if you take a look at the network firewall services, just take a look at all three different cloud service CSP. Those network firewalls are brand spanking new, literally. Is within the last couple of years that they started offering it. And then, because, some of the customers are like, hey, you give me a free firewall, right? Like some of those network groups and stuff like that. It worked, right? 5-6 years ago, when we use the cloud, that's how we started. And then some of the customers are like, hey, we need NG firewall capabilities. And so, your AWS and so on come up with these capabilities. And there's nothing wrong with it. And they are literally, as you stated, that these are traditional firewall equivalent. They are specifically meant to protect your IaaS, like infrastructure as a service environment, like your EC2 equivalent, your compute environment. They're not necessarily there to protect your PaaS-based environment. And your current modern workload will likely comprehend your IaaS environment and some of the PaaS-based services, like most of your microservices are going to be here, there, everywhere, right? So absolutely, I agree that defense in depth is really, really crucial. Not just a single firewall can protect you nowadays. Good. I think those are all the questions. And thanks for the comment. Learn something. I'm glad that you learned something. With that, we're going to end the webcast here. Thank you, everyone, for attending here.
Thanks, everyone.